The gas station was still lit in the dead of night, the fluorescent lights flickering faintly, creating faint shadows on the old concrete. Standing along the deserted highway in Bakersfield, California, the only sounds were the lonely chirping of crickets, the wind rustling through tattered billboards, and the occasional squeal of tires on the road. It was a quiet night, and it seemed as if whatever happened here would forever be swallowed up by the darkness. Obadiah Kane stepped out of the convenience store, a cold bottle of water in hand. He sighed, feeling the cool night air fill his lungs, a pleasant feeling after a long journey. Years of service to his country had shaped him into a calm man, but also filled him with fatigue. He was no stranger to danger, to life-and-death decisions, to the price of shouldering the burden of a soldier. But tonight, here, he was just a regular guy, looking to stop, get a drink of water, and get going. In the distance, headlights swept across the sidewalk. A patrol car roared by, tires crunching into gravel. Young Officer Brent Calloway sat in the car, eyes glued to the silhouette of the man in front of him. He didn't see a veteran, didn't see a man who had sat with presidents in rooms where the fates of thousands of people were decided. Calloway saw only a black man, standing alone at night, next to a car too nice for what he thought was normal. Reports of suspicious activity around the gas station echoed in his head. Alert. Suspicion. Instinct. Calloway's hand tightened on the gun at his side. Adrenaline surged. This could be his moment. The moment his colleagues often recounted in police station stories. The moment an officer could prove his instincts. He opened the car door and stepped out, his voice strained. Stop. Put your hands up. Obadiah paused, his eyes on the officer. In that moment, he realized what was happening. Too fast. Too familiar. He had seen this in the most brutal places of war, but he had never thought it would happen to him, right on the land he had spent his life protecting. A gunshot rang out. The darkness swallowed everything, leaving only the flickering fluorescent lights, reflecting Calloway's bewildered eyes as he realized his mistake. Too late. Too late to pull back the shot. Too late to see that the man was not a threat, but a hero who had devoted his life to this country. The sound of a water bottle hitting the ground. Rolling. Breaking. Obadiah Kane leaned back in the driver's seat, chewing a bland piece of gum before flicking it over his shoulder. The gum stuck to the back seat of the passenger seat. An old habit, innocuous, or so he thought. He hadn't noticed the approaching threat. There was no warning, just a voice that sliced through the night like a sharp blade. Hands where I can see them. Obadiah froze. His head turned slowly, just enough to take in the scene before him. A cold glint of light reflected in the darkness, metal glinting, the barrel of a gun aimed at his chest. For a split second, his body reacted before his mind could catch up. Survival instinct kicked in, decades of war, years of training, hundreds of close calls. A wave of fury coursed through his veins, urging him to act. But he didn't move. Because this wasn't a battlefield. Not Afghanistan. Not Iraq. Not the deadly desert where he had fought insurgents and lived to tell the tale. This was home. And the look in Calloway's eyes told him that none of that mattered right now. On this ground, tonight, his past exploits held no advantage. Calloway stood there, his gun steady but his finger trembling on the trigger. His posture was rigid, his breath coming in short gasps. Adrenaline pumping through every cell, urging him to make a decision. Obadiah had seen this before, a man waiting to make a choice. Slowly, carefully, he raised his hands to chest height, opening his palms so they were visible. His voice was low and calm, the way he had spoken to young soldiers on the verge of making an irreversible mistake. Officer, what's going on? But Calloway didn't see an innocent citizen. He didn't see a veteran. He didn't see a general who had shed blood for this country. He saw only a threat. The air was heavy, as thin as a taut thread. One false move, one sudden jerk, and the night could be torn apart by gunfire. A bloody end. But then, flashing red and blue lights tore the night apart. Another police car slid into the parking lot, tires screeching on the cement. The door swung open, and another officer rushed out. "Wait! Stop!" And at that moment, the plot turned. Obadiah didn't breathe too hard. He didn't shift his stance, didn't dare lower his hand. He'd seen what happened when men in uniform made snap decisions. Split-second choices. Life-ending mistakes. But this time, there was no battlefield. No enemies lurking in the trees. No helicopters waiting for his signal. Just the flashing neon lights of a gas station. An empty parking lot. And a young cop with a gun, his nerves shaking. Brent Calloway. Obadiah knew what Calloway didn't. Young people were the most dangerous. Not because they were ruthless. Not because they were hungry for power. But because they had something to prove. To themselves. To their superiors. To the world. Calloway didn't see a man. He didn't see a veteran, a hero who had fought and died. He saw only what he chose to see. A black man. An expensive SUV parked at night. A file. A question. A reason, just one reason, was all he needed. Obadiah had lived through worse. He grew up in Louisiana. A time when some gas stations refused to let him in. His father, a mechanic, had said, "They're always going to judge you from the start. Your job is to not give them a reason to." And Obadiah did. He worked twice as hard. He got into West Point. Spent 3 decades proving himself on the battlefield. His name carried weight in the military. In some parts of the world, when he entered a room, men would stand at attention. But here, at this moment, none of that mattered. Tonight, rank wouldn't save him. He kept his voice calm. "Control. Officer, I'm just reaching for my wallet." He moved slowly, painfully slow. His fingers barely moved as they reached for his pocket. But Calloway tensed instantly. "Don't move." Obadiah stopped. His hands were still in the air. His fingers were spread. His jaw was clenched but his face was expressionless. He knew what this was. He knew what men like Calloway were telling themselves. He knew how many people didn't go home for a moment like this. A policeman drew his gun. A shot rang out in the night. A distorted story the next morning. Obadiah had seen senseless death on the battlefield. But dying in his own hometown, in a deserted parking lot. That was a different kind of war. And he wasn't sure he could win. He moved too fast. His movements were suspicious. Calloway could feel it, like a chill down his spine. His instincts told him, it could be a weapon. A real threat. No, Obadiah didn't give him that, but the voice in Calloway's head wasn't strong enough to erase the fear. Because facts didn't matter. Feelings mattered more. And the feeling said the man before him could strike at any moment. But he didn't move. Not shifting. Barely breathing. Only Calloway's finger twitched on the trigger. And for the first time tonight, Obadiah felt it was a possibility, a real chance. One small mistake, and this kid would pull the trigger. Not because of the actual danger, but because of the way Calloway held the gun, the way his eyes widened with fear. He had convinced himself he was in danger. Then the tires screeched. Red and green lights filled the parking lot. Another police car was faster than expected. Calloway flinched, but kept his gun pointed. The car door opened. An officer stepped out, walking quickly and decisively. No hesitation. No faltering. She had known something was wrong even in the car. Lieutenant Vanessa Grayson. She had been in the force long enough to recognize when a rookie was in over his head. As she stepped out of the cruiser, surveying the scene before her, her stomach clenched. Not with fear, but with knowledge. She saw a civilian with his hand raised. An officer with his gun still drawn. The tension was so thick it could explode with a breath. But as her eyes scanned the scene, as she recognized the figure standing in the gas station lights, her heart nearly leapt out of her chest. Obadiah Kane. Damn it. She knew him. She'd seen his face in the military papers, in briefings. She knew exactly who he was, and that meant things were about to get a lot worse. Calloway didn't notice the tension in Grayson's eyes. He was still locked in his confrontation, jaw clenched, breathing ragged. This man is acting suspiciously. Calloway exclaimed, her voice sharp and defensive. I need him in handcuffs right now. But Grayson didn't react. She didn't look at Calloway, didn't listen to his excuses. Her gaze remained fixed on Obadiah. Because she knew the truth. And she knew that if she didn't act now, things could get irreversible. The weight of the moment sank deep into her chest. It felt like the world was holding its breath with her, waiting to see what her next move would be. But there was still a chance, a way to stop things before they got out of hand, before there was no turning back. Calloway. She said, careful as if she were treading on thin ice. Her voice was steady, not high, but there was something in it, a sharp edge that demanded attention. She kept her voice neutral, not betraying any emotion, but her hands moved before her thoughts. She lowered the gun. A long moment passed, as if time had stretched. Calloway whipped his head toward her, his eyes wide with surprise. But what changed the atmosphere was not just her action, but the name she was about to say. That man is General Obadiah Kane. Her words fell like a silent bullet, piercing through everything. Calloway stiffened. His face was pale, as if the blood had been drained from his face in a heartbeat. The fingers that had gripped the gun loosened a little. Grayson stepped forward, his voice low but heavy as stone. You just pointed a gun at a 4-star general. Like a cold wave, nausea rose in Calloway's stomach. That name, he knew it. Heard it before. But his brain hadn't connected the dots in time. It was too late now. His mouth opened as if to say something, but no words came out. Obadiah Kane stared at him. No anger, no fear. Just sharp observation, as if he'd seen this scene too many times before, in the eyes of the police, in the eyes of the soldiers, in the eyes of the men who realized they'd gone too far. The tension was as tight as a bowstring, but it didn't snap the way they expected. Because something changed. A faint light. A bright light. A small red dot. A camera. Oh my God, did you see this? A bystander's shaky voice rang out. A phone was raised. A video was being recorded. And suddenly, this was no longer a tense confrontation between three people. It was evidence. The video spread like wildfire. At first, it was just a short, shaky, grainy clip, posted by the first witness. But then other angles appeared, other voices chimed in, each with their own perspective, but all telling the same story. A famous general. A gun pointed at his face. A young police officer who didn't hesitate. Hours later, it was everywhere. News channels played the clip over and over again. The headlines left no room for ambiguity. A young policeman points a gun at the general. The price of a moment. No longer an accident. But a storm. Police draw gun, 4-star general falls, outrage erupts. The meeting took place in a room filled with bright lights and a tense atmosphere. No one expected that in a split second, the incident would turn into a political and social storm. When the rookie police officer raised his gun and pulled the trigger, the whole country was shocked. General Kane, a war hero, a symbol of patriotism, fell with a wound in his shoulder. Immediately, chaos broke out. Senior officers rushed into the middle, shouting, giving orders. Was it a fatal mistake or a manifestation of a system rotten from within? Immediate outrage. Every major news channel aired the shocking footage. On TV screens, phones, tablets, and laptops, the video played over and over again. General Kane, eyes filled with shock and pain, collapsed to the floor as the gunshot rang out. In coffee shops, in break rooms, in the living rooms of millions of homes, people were talking, seething. Debates were raging, but outrage was the dominant emotion. A former Marine appeared on live television, his voice shaking with rage. This man gave his life to protect this country. And this is how we treat him. No one saw this as a simple accident. No, it was a familiar pattern. Social media exploded. The hashtags #JusticeForKane and #PoliceReformNow quickly trended. Twitter was ablaze with angry tweets. Instagram stories were filled with clips and analysis. The video topped the front page of Reddit, garnering thousands of discussions. Because this wasn't just about General Kane. This was about all the black men who were seen as threats before they were seen as human beings. This is about every frivolous check, every wrongful arrest, every life taken because of a split-second decision. This time, the victim survived. But that didn't quell the rage. The authority backed into a corner. The Bakersfield Police Department quickly found itself on the defensive. Within 24 hours, Officer Calloway, the shooter, was placed on administrative leave. The mayor appeared before the press, saying, "We take this incident very seriously. A full investigation is underway." But that's not what people wanted to hear. They didn't want empty promises. They wanted action. The police chief looked flustered at the press conference, trying to control the damage with carefully crafted words. "We recognize the gravity of the situation. We are committed to transparency and justice." But no one believed those promises anymore. Outside City Hall, a crowd had gathered. Banners were raised. Chant echoed through the city. "Justice for Kane. Police reform now." The fight was no longer about one man. It had become a symbol of a larger fight, a fight for justice. And this time, there was no silence. Obadiah Kane wasn't about the fame. When the interview requests poured in, he didn't shy away. He picked one. Not to talk about himself, but to talk about the bigger issue. Because this was never about him. Now, the world was watching. The studio lights were bright, but Obadiah Kane didn't flinch. He had stood in war zones, where life and death could be decided in seconds. Compared to those moments, this was nothing. But this time, it mattered in a different way. He sat across from the CBS anchor. His posture was straight, his gaze steady. The world was waiting. The anchor leaned forward, his fingers clasped, his tone cautious but curious. "General Kane, the video of your encounter has been seen by millions. Walk us through what was going through your mind." Obadiah was quiet for a second. A second to consider, to give weight to the words. Then he spoke, with the same calmness that had commanded soldiers on the battlefield. "I've thought about how close I came, to being just another name on a list." The studio was silent. The host didn't interrupt. He let the words sink in, sink in. Obadiah continued, his voice steady, no anger, no drama, just plain fact. "That cop didn't see me. Not really. He just saw a story that was already written in his head." Everyone held their breath. They didn't just hear, they felt what he said. And how many times has this happened? How many times has it ended differently? Obadiah shifted slightly in his chair, his fingers tightening. He looked directly at the camera, at the millions watching. "I'm alive because I know how to stay calm. Because I'm trained to handle pressure. But does a person's survival depend on that?" Before the interview ended, the video exploded online. His words weren't just heard. They were remembered. "I survived because I kept my cool. But did survival really depend on that? The cop didn't see me. He saw a target. Activists, veterans. Community leaders. They weren't just speaking out, they were roaring for justice. The conversation changed. This was no longer just an isolated incident. It was a system that allowed this to continue. The Bakersfield Police Department was forced to respond. The chief held another press conference. Tired, tense, eyes heavy. We're reforming. We're expanding our de-escalation tactics. We're going to look at our bias review process. But the public wasn't satisfied. Protests erupted. Lawsuits began to roll out. The Justice Department announced an investigation. Officer Brent Calloway resigned quietly. No apology, no statement of responsibility. But Obadiah wasn't looking for a scapegoat. He wanted something bigger, change. As the interview ended, the host tilted his head. General Kane, what do you hope will happen in this situation? Obadiah looked directly into the camera. Directly into the eyes watching from behind the screen. We say protect and serve. But that promise can't be selective. The studio fell silent. If a man can spend his life fighting for his country, only to come home and be seen as a threat, then we have a much bigger problem. The camera held still for a second. Long enough for the weight of those words to sink in. Then the screen faded to black. This story is not just about one man. It is about the unrecorded moments. The mistakes no one talks about. The lives that don't get a second chance. Next time, the ending might be different. And the question is, what are we going to do about it? If this story makes you think, don't just scroll past it. Share it. Talk about it. And most importantly, ask for a better world.